Okay, so our goal was to leave lots of time for questions, but I think we're taking it up with all our technical difficulties, so I apologize. So at any rate, why does it matter? Well, that's a question we get asked quite a bit. So if puberty starting earlier, and there appears to be a normative trend toward puberty starting earlier, does it really matter? And the research looking at the consequences of early puberty among boys and girls shows that for girls it seems to. Boys, the jury's still out, and there's a lot of leading edge research going on right now in that area, which, so stay tuned on that. But for girls in adolescence, early puberty seems to lead to problems like depression and anxiety at higher rates. Also, even though overweight and obesity seems to be linked to puberty starting early, it also seems to put girls at higher risk for being overweight during adolescence. Also, substance use, tobacco initiation, alcohol, marijuana, early sexual initiation, early pregnancy, those kinds of things. So we worry about it in adolescence, but what are the long-term effects? Unfortunately, it seems that, and folks probably know this if you're in the breast cancer field, that early menarche seems linked to breast cancer later. Pretty consistent in this line of work, but we don't know much about early breast development, which you would think would probably be even more important when you're talking about the developing breast, particular insults, and the rate at which the breast is developing. So that's where our research is focused right now. Also, what you might not expect is that poor cardiovascular health, CVD, also seems linked to early puberty among girls. So that's kind of the depressing story. I think also something to be aware of, a very understudied area is what are the positive outcomes that might be related to early puberty for girls. And so this is just to give you a preview, but we are looking at things now like social skills and leadership, and also what happens if you intervene early and you help girls be more empowered around their body and their sexual health, and also how to take charge in leadership roles as they're going through puberty earlier. What are the drivers? So this is kind of when Louise and I decided to write a book about early puberty, and there were so many myths out in the world about, well, it's the chicken we eat, and it's the milk we drink, and various things. So please feel free to ask questions about those things. But what has really come out of the literature, and the strongest, most robust literature, is that there are 3 drivers that are expected to probably cause secular trends in earlier puberty. And one is, not surprisingly, kind of the obesity epidemic that we're experiencing in this country. And Louise is going to talk a little bit about that in a moment. Also, psychosocial stress, something you might not be aware of, or adversity in early life, seems to be linked to early puberty. And finally, there's been a lot of concern about endocrine disrupting chemicals in our environment, or chemical exposures. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but I'm going to turn it over to Louise to talk about obesity.
So one of the main findings for the paper that came out in 2013, and this is a graph from that paper, our first author was Biro, was that girls who have earlier onset of puberty are more likely to be obese. But I don't want you to think it's causality. So keep causality out of this for a moment and think of an association. So what we see here is remember I talked about the Herman Giddens girls. The Herman Giddens 1997 paper, these are the girls. This is age here, and this is the percent who had breast stage 2 or thelarchy, Tanner stage 2 or pubertal stage 2. So this was the baseline at 97, and our birth cohort is 10 years or so older, maybe about 10 to 15 years older. What you see here is that the girls, these are for non-Hispanic white girls. The girls here, these are the girls who are not overweight. And although they are earlier than Herman Giddens, they're not necessarily that much earlier. These are all girls. When we separate out the girls whose BMI was greater than the 85th percentile, you can see that they are going through puberty significantly earlier than the girls who were not obese. So again, these are the obese girls, these are the non-obese, and this is Herman Giddens. So we think that obesity is a major factor. This is probably the only complicated slide, I promise. So what you have up here are endocrine disrupting chemicals and how they may affect the life course. Here is fat tissue. Fat tissue is larger based on energy balance, but it's not as simple as energy in and energy out. I think that is obviously a contributor, but it's overly simplistic. We know that prenatal growth factors are, so Joan Lowe and I, whose sister Eliza is part of the Old Girl Network that got me to talk here, have done research looking at risk factors, and we have as well with the puberty study. I think you all know people who, women with gestational diabetes have children who are more obese, and it looks like they're also going through puberty earlier. Regardless of their BMI later, it looks like pound for pound, if you had a uterus that had gestational diabetes in it, you are more likely to be obese. And then we have environmental triggers, and this is where I want to bring out the association versus causality. Maybe there are environmentally disrupting chemicals, or EDCs, endocrine disrupting chemicals, that make you overweight, that then trigger early puberty. Maybe there are EDCs, and we think there are a couple that might cause early puberty and overweight. So what does this fat tissue do? Well, the fat tissue makes aromatase. That's probably the most important thing they make. And the aromatase converts that testosterone that all girls have into estrogen. So the more fat tissue you have, the higher estrogen you have. In addition, the fat tissue is making the liver make less sex hormone binding globulin. So that means your estrogen is more freely available. And the ovaries and the androgens are making more, the ovaries and the adrenals are making more androgens, which then goes to be converted with aromatase. All of this leads to higher rates of estrogen and higher insulin resistance, which feeds back on itself to make greater bioavailability of sex steroids, and this promotes earlier adrenarche. So it is complex, but it's actually really important that people understand that obesity may be a trigger, but there may be a common causality behind the obesity as well. But obesity is definitely a factor.
So one of the things I want you to put a sticky note in as you look at that slide is, where do chemicals reside in the body? And the fat-soluble chemicals also may reside in the fat. And so if there's more fat availability, they may reside longer in the body. And that's something to think about during these really vulnerable periods, one of which might be puberty, when there's lots of changes happening in the body as well. Oh, thanks. Oh, I wasn't doing that, was it? Do you want to do it for me? Because I can't really see there. Okay, great. So, yeah, it's hard to see. One thing, so as a psychologist and someone who studies kind of eco-bio-developmental aspects of puberty and growth, I want you to also think about where the individual resides. So we think a lot when we talk about puberty about endocrinology and what's happening just in the individual body, but one of the things we're learning is that, thank you, one of the things we're learning is not just that early puberty has differential effects for girls depending on where they're living. We're doing a lot of work in low-income communities, and particularly one great study down in the Salinas Valley, which is an agricultural area or region, where we're looking at chemicals and poverty and really high levels of toxic stress. And so we know that girls, if they're going through puberty early in those contexts, sometimes don't do as well. However, Latino girls, African American girls who are going through puberty in areas where there's more Latinos and African Americans seem to do better. Now, why might that be? Because they're going through puberty earlier. And it's possible that their peers are too, and it's possible that it may not be sexualized the way it is, right, in other more heterogeneous contexts. So it's important to consider the environment, both in terms of how a girl does going through puberty and also what are the factors that may be causing her to go through puberty early. This slide is going to be surprising, I think, to some people. There are many factors that contribute to whether puberty starts early in a girl that have been established in the literature. One is breastfeeding, and not surprisingly, it seems to be protective, although some of the literature is mixed. Good area of study for students. We've done some work looking at in utero factors like pre-pregnancy obesity, gestational weight gain, and those also seem to be influencing whether puberty starts early and putting girls at more risk. Also, controversial things like father absence in the home, early sexual abuse, but not physical abuse, seems to predict earlier puberty among girls. Also, family dysfunction, conflict, attachment, socioeconomic status, et cetera. So lots of things you might not suspect, but have been established for decades. They just never made their way into the medical literature. They were kind of housed in the psychological literature. And on to briefly chemicals. Lots of things are suspected to disrupt the endocrine process. We can talk about them later, probably not in depth, but one of the things we're most concerned about is the early use among tweens of beauty products that have endocrine disrupting chemicals in them. So let's quickly go past this to the next slide. Also, not to further frighten people, there's things in your household. You know, we talk a lot about BPA and hard plasticizers. We don't know the effects of them. We're not sure if they're related to puberty. They're definitely related to neurocognitive development, so that alone is probably worth getting the hard plasticizers out of your home. Teflon, certain toothpastes, PBDEs, you know, the flame retardants, which we finally got out of California furniture, right? So, and I'm just going to zoom through this. I think one thing that's important to recognize is that there is a huge, huge marketing of products to teens right now. And so in the US alone, and this is old data, $20 million of 8 to 12-year-olds they're spending, 20 million of these folks are spending 30 billion of their own money. I always wonder, I have 2 tweens, so wondering how they get their own money is questionable. And 150 million of their parents' money in a year. Great, thank you. And also, I think something I wanted to just mention, especially as mothers, a shocking amount of teens are actually using chemical products. And so, whereas I think we use 7 products a day as adults on average, they're using 12 or more products a day. So we're talking about things they slather on their skin and things they put on their faces and then whatever their pimple cream is and whatnot, right? Finally, we have no idea how these chemicals interact with one another, nor do we know how they interact with stress in the environment. It's really hard to do studies of chemicals in terms of admixtures or mixes, and so they tend to be one-to-one-to-one studies, but we know we're living in a virtual toxic soup, particularly if you're growing up in disadvantaged communities. And finally, I just want to point out, given the communities that I work in, which tend to be underserved, that the inequities are absolutely astronomical. And so as epidemiologists and psychologists, we're often told not to call things a social justice issue. It's a social justice issue. It's really like an experiment gone wrong when you look at some of these communities and you look at the pesticide exposure, you look at the food they can access, and you also start to pay attention to a variety of other things that we can talk about. And so resources. Do you want to go ahead with resources?
Yeah, and I'm hoping we have time for questions, but I think we did lose some time with the technical difficulties at the end. Okay. Oh, okay. So there's a bunch of resources I want to bring your attention to, and I think if you want to do an action item today, the first action item would be to download this app, the Healthy Living app, and that's what it looks like. And I've given talks where I've actually told people to take out their phones. You don't have to do that right now, but this is the Environmental Working Group's app, and I am that person who is in the grocery store scanning everything. Because I am not an environmental scientist, and these products change all the time. And so in order to stay up on the products, you really want to make sure that you use this app. The Environmental Working Group also puts out the Clean 15, Dirty Dozen. These are foods with pesticides that may have health effects. This is 2016's one. There's 2017 came out, and it's different because the growers are always changing what they're putting on the food. And there are other resources. If you have kids or you are a pediatrician or family practice doc who takes care of kids, please recommend books such as the American Girl books. They're not $110 like the dolls. There's 2 of them. There's the Care and Keeping of You 1 and 2. And Karen Natterson, who I was a resident with, has recently redone these, and she's great. So they were pediatric advised. Also, the other Think Dirty is an app that kids like. There's Something About You is from Girlology, our book. And we love Susan Stifelman's book, Parenting Without Power Struggles. She's doing an online parenting session next week that we're part of. If you're interested in advocacy or political action, the Center for Environmental Health is very reliable. I would say that the Vote With Your Wallet movement counts for this. And if you want to affect change, a really great way to do that is to change what you buy and counsel all your friends about your new great sunscreen that hasn't got chemicals in it. And Ken Cook, who runs the Environmental Working Group, really worked with us a lot. And he's talked about going through, when you buy your next products, buy one that's rated well on the EWG app. They don't take any money from that. They're just looking at the science. And there's a reason Costco is now selling organic fruits and vegetables, right? And if Costco sells it, then that means other people can buy it. And my closing point would be, if you're gonna spend money on something, don't you think you should spend your extra money, if you have it and you can, buying organic fruits and vegetables? What better thing could you spend a little extra money on? People have told me they feel guilty. they feel guilty spending money on that. And I would say there's no better thing that you could spend money on. So if you are able to buy organic fruits and vegetables or products, I would encourage you to do so. It may or may not affect the health of your children, but it will affect the health of the people who are farming them. So that's my little soapbox. And then other resources, hormone.org is the endocrine society. They're really taking the lead on leadership in terms of advocacy for changing and getting EDCs out of products. So they have some really good handouts. So, and this is our website. Thank you. Sorry.